What's up guys, it's Double Zug, so I'm coming at you here from the beta character creation screen. With Joyous Journeys coming out soon, I figure a lot of you have been waiting for Joyous Journeys to either return to the game to level a new character, or to cap an old character from a previous expansion, or you're going to be leveling a new main for Mists of Pandaria. So to hopefully save you some heartache, maybe some time, and some money on race changes, I'm going to go through every single healer spec and just really quickly give you like a tier list of every racial for that healing spec. And then to finish it out, I'm also going to talk about the BIS professions. Those kind of apply to every single healer spec, so that'll be very quick as well. Let's start with the two specs that are the most spec limited, that being Paladin and Druid. Get Pandaren in Mists of Pandaria, but Pandaren cannot be Druid or Paladin. So unfortunately, we don't have access to the new OP racials. However, that can be a little bit of a benefit given that you don't have to shell out some cash to race swap. So for Paladin, for Alliance, there's a lot of choices, but they're not all very good, honestly. So Human, insane for PvP. Also, they get 3% increased Spirit, which for Paladin is actually pretty good. Also, the increased Expertise will affect your like melee swings and stuff, which is just a small extra benefit. Dwarf is just like a PvP race, but worse than Human for PvP. Draenei is like, again, kind of basically just useless. The like casted heal you get is like okay. We're mana limited in MoP, and so it's just free HPS, but it's just a very low impact. So basically, you're just going to pick Human. It's the most generic race and class combo that's not Human Warrior, Human Paladin. For Horde, we do have Tauren Paladins in MoP. However, Tauren does not get its like crit effect scaling racial in MoP yet. It still just has the useless like maximum HP and War Stomp. But we are definitely just not going to be taking Tauren. We're going to be taking Blood Elf. The Blood Elf racial is highly nerfed in MoP. In Kata, it gives you 6% mana, and also your mana pool scales with intellect, so it will scale with your gear. Whereas in MoP, it just gives you 2%, and your mana pool doesn't increase. So the racial is like very nerfed in terms of its mana restore. So that's Paladin, pretty much unchanged, right, from previous versions. It's just Human and Blood Elf. All right, so let's talk about Druid next. Druid basically unchanged. Pandaren cannot be Druid. So you're just stuck with the Cataclysm options of Night Elf or Worgen for Alliance, and Tauren or Troll for Horde. There's very, very clear correct answer from a HPS throughput damage perspective for both Alliance and Horde, that being Worgen. The 1% crit is 600 crit rating, I believe, so that's like 2 full gems. Pretty strong. Troll, the haste cooldown is really nice for Druid. You can line it up with your Incarn, which is your tree form. Your Nature's Vigil, every other Nature's Vigil. Very strong little throughput cooldown there. As well as the 5% damage from Troll, which is something that's going to repeat over these specs, actually being kind of relevant. I think there's like 2 bosses in Throne of Thunder that are beasts. So getting a random 5% damage increase just from your racial is like kind of insane. And Resto Druid can do some nice burst damage with Heart of the Wild. So overall, a very clear choice for Druid. Priest here, there's a decent number of races that have some benefit here. For Alliance, Human is great for PvP, obviously with the Trinket, but the HPS benefit of the 3% Spirit is very, very minimal, and the Expertise doesn't matter at all. Your Spirit racial, like in Phase 1, it's going to give you like maybe 200 Spirit maximum, which is like 400-ish HPS, and a little bit of damage from some extra smites, but just very outclassed by some of the other racials. Dwarf, again, just a PvP race. Night Elf, again, just like pretty bad. Gnome's 5% mana increase racial is like one of the very few things left in the game that will increase your mana pool. Well, this would be insane for Discipline Priest and Cataclysm because of like Rapture, Archangel, that stuff. For Mists of Pandaria, Priest loses a lot of its percentage-based mana regen, so Gnome is just like very suboptimal. However, it's like a little bit better than Human racial, actually. So it gives you like 0.5%, whereas the Human racial is like 0.2. So not a huge difference, but decently sizable. Draenei, if you use the like hot thing on CD, it's like okay-ish. Worgen is just like busted insane. 1% crit is I think about 600 crit rating. And this is very, very strong early and will get better and better as the phases go on and crit rating becomes better and better. Lastly, we have Pandaren. Pandaren is going to be a common refrain across all these healing specs where it's very, very strong. Obviously, like the rested XP and the like less fall damage don't matter at all, but the extra benefit from food is very, very powerful. You're basically always going to be using this to get 300 extra intellect. Like guides online and stuff say to use this to get spirit early. That's just like incorrect. Basically, this Pandaren racial is 300 intellect, and that's very strong for every single healer, and it's also decent on the off-spec flex. So For Alliance, you will be taking either Pandaren or Worgen. They're very, very, very close. However, Worgen will inch it out a little bit as you go on later in the expansion. For Horde, we have access to Undead Priest, which is just a PvP race. Our main choice here is going to be Troll. So Troll is a little bit interesting for Discipline Priest. The Berserk Haste cooldown is not hugely significant in terms of healing, but it's quite nice for damage. You're going to be using this like during Lust and with your first Mindbender or Shadow Fiend, and that's going to be a decent chunk of extra damage. However, for healing, maybe you can use this to get an extra POH in a Spirit Shell window or something, but overall, really not like a hugely significant overall HPS increase. Blood Elf, again, nerfed heavily in its mana return, so I just wouldn't really play Blood Elf. For Goblin, the Goblin jump is actually kind of powerful. Goblin still has its place. However, the 1% haste is just not like an important healing stat for us at all in Mists of Pandaria. So I would recommend tending towards Troll as well as the next option, which is Pandaren. Pandaren, again, just passive, no thought. You don't have to like press your berserking, you just get it. And 300 intellect is very, very strong for Discipline Priest. So there's definitely conversation here, but if I had to give you a best, for Horde it would be Pandaren, and for Alliance it would be Worgen. All right, so next let's talk about Shaman. Shaman has a lot of options on Horde, but not so many on Alliance. We have Dwarf Shamans in MoP, but they're, again, just like useless for healing. We have Draenei Shamans. The like little hot you get is like okay-ish. Really the choice for Alliance is just going to be Pandaren Shaman. That 300 intellect is amazing. For Horde, we have a lot more options. We have Orc. Orc gives you the little 2-minute cooldown, which gives you some attack power and some spell power. The pet damage also does scale your like improved Ellies, which is quite nice. You can do some decent damage. We have Tauren Shamans. Again, Tauren just like the useless race. Troll Shaman is incredibly powerful. The reason for this is that Berserk, which is a haste cooldown, lines up with our Healing Tide. You can also stack it with like your Ascendants and stuff like that, but usually you're going to be using this with your Healing Tide totem. So I have some math here where like in 25-man, just the extra ticks you get from Healing Tide totem is going to be like 1.5% healing, is more than like every other racial for Shaman. So just that is worth it. However, you're also going to be getting some other benefits, right? You're going to be getting some extra ticks from your Riptides you cast during the CD. You're probably going to get like 1 or 2 extra ticks of Healing Rain inside the CD. So all that stuff together makes this racial just incredibly powerful. So for Horde, I would just 100% go Troll if you care about your HPS at all. Goblin for Shaman is okay if the 1% haste gets you over a big breakpoint for like Healing Rain. Again, Pandaren very, very strong, but just kind of outclassed by Troll. All right, last but obviously not least, we have the new class Monk. Can be basically everything except the Kata races. So Worgen and Goblin cannot be Monk, but every single other race can be Monk. So it's going to take a while to go through all these options here. Fortunately, there's basically not that many that are that good. So for Human Monk, obviously very good for PvP, but the Spirit doesn't really give us that much benefit for PvE. Dwarf, again, just like a PvP race, but worse than Human. Night Elf, Shadow Meld, maybe there's some like use for it in challenge modes, routing. But for Raid, pretty useless. Gnome, the 5% mana pool from Gnome is actually decently good for Monk compared to the other healers. I haven't done the math like super in depth for this versus the other good options, but I do think it's probably decently competitive in terms of HPS with the other racials. The problem is that you ever flex to like Brewmaster or Windwalker, Gnome is just going to be much worse. Pandaren is the strongest for the Alliance. 300 intellect is just great. Overall for Alliance, I would definitely tend towards Pandaren. For Horde, we have Orc. Orc is great for Windwalker and decent for Brewmaster as well. Mistweaver, if you're going to be focusing damage output a lot, I think Orc is actually really good. The pet damage does scale Zwen, I believe, and Zwen does a huge amount of damage. And you can also use your like 2-minute attack power thing for Zwen. Undead, again, just a PvP race. Tauren, again, useless for the 6th time. Troll is decent. I think you really only have like your Rems that are scaling with that, which is your hot. However, if you do use your Berserk with like a Thunder Focus to reset on all your hots, you can get a decent amount of healing from this, but overall, I think that's a lot of work for not too much gain. For damage, it's fine. Blood Elf, again, very, very nerfed on the mana return here. I think overall, Pandaren is going to be really, really nice for Mistweaver. Overall, I would tend towards Pandaren. However, taking something like Orc or Troll can also be just fine as well. The difference here is not going to be huge, probably like 0.5 or 0.4% maximum spread between best and worst. If I had to pick, I would tend towards Pandaren for Mistweaver for both factions. Alright, so that's this race for every single spec. Really quickly here, I wanted to show you, like, this is my Druid that I run on GDKP, and this is my Dragon Soul logs, and I'm not showing this just to flex, but, you know, I think I'm like rank 12. I think I capped at like rank 6. I have like rank 1 parses here, and this character is an old Druid from Wrath of the Lich King that I was too lazy / cheap to race swap to Troll and Cataclysm, and I still performed really well and like parsed really well and did really high HPS. So the point of this is to say that if you want to pick a race for aesthetic reasons or for PvP or for a flex DPS spec, or if you're just too lazy or too cheap like me to race swap to the best, it's really not a big deal for healing. The difference is, again, like maximum 1%. The outlier here being Troll Shaman, which is a little bit more than 1%. Things like player skill, your healer count in your raid, how your raid plays, and the strategies you use are going to have a vastly higher impact on your HPS than your racials. All right, so now let's very quickly talk about professions. So the professions here are going to be very straightforward, and it's basically the same thing for every healer. So basically all the main crafting professions all just basically give you the same amount of flat main stat. Really the only professions that give you any kind of a different bonus are going to be your gathering professions, engineering, blacksmithing, and tailoring. So those are the things we're really going to be talking about here. And engineering is the same thing as it is in Kata. It gives you the main stat on your gloves on a 60-second. With how few like on-use trinkets there are that people really use in MoP, doesn't really compete too much with your trinkets. And for a lot of the healers, this 1-minute cooldown lines up really well with your shorter cooldowns. Despite the fact that it averages out to 320 intellect, you can usually get extra value out of this if you play it correctly. The other two benefits you get from engineering is a pre-bis helmet, as well as nitro boots. Because of how the talent trees work, basically every spec gets an extra movement ability in MoP, which means that every extra piece of mobility is less valuable, so nitro boots is a little bit less valuable, but it's still very powerful to have. Luckily, you probably have already leveled engineering if you have raided in any previous expansion, so a little bit of gold saved there, a little bit of time saved there, hopefully. Blacksmithing gives you 2 extra gem sockets. Secondary gems give you double the value compared to main stat gems. So the fact that blacksmithing can give you secondary stat instead of main stat is actually pretty significant in MoP. If you don't want main stat and you want something like haste or crit, you can always choose to get that. Tailoring is interesting because it gives you the option to have an intellect proc on your cloak. You will lose a 180 int base from the enchant, but you gain on average 320 intellect. This is going to be usually a damage increase over the other professions because of how it stacks up with things like lust and your trinket procs, and any cooldowns like Shadow Fiend or Joanne or something like that. So if you're going for pure like healer damage for something like Disc Priest or Mistweaver, tailoring's probably a little bit better than blacksmithing early on. However, there's really not too much difference between this and the other main stats in my opinion, so if you want to go NG and anything else, it's just fine. The last thing I'll mention here is that some like guides I saw out there were telling you to get the spirit enchant as a healer. As far as I can tell, unless like the ICD numbers are just completely wrong, the intellect one is just always better. Overall, you just don't really care about your second profession too much as long as it's a main stat one. However, BS and tailoring are like situationally pretty good. The last thing I'll mention here is the gathering professions. These are actually not terrible. Skinning, especially for Discipline Priest, 480 crit is very close to 320 intellect. So if you want to make gold as a Discipline Priest, skinning's fine. Herbalism gives you a 3k haste on use on a 2-minute for 20 seconds. So this is 480 haste average. But given that this is an on use, you get a little bit of extra value from this. Also, for the specs that have significant haste breakpoints, this can be a little bit more valuable. So something like a Restoration Shaman, if this gets you an extra tick on your Healing Tide, some extra ticks in your Healing Rain, your Riptide potentially, this will gain some value. However, generally speaking, I would always prefer a main stat profession over herbalism. Speaking of gold, if you don't have a lot of gold and you prefer not to swipe or like do GDKPs, the best professions to make gold lazily, if you don't want to like buy patterns and do crafting and all that stuff, are going to be alchemy and inscription. You just do them. You don't even have to buy the mats, right? You can just sell the cooldown in trade chat or whatever, and you can get some passive gold that way. So that's professions. Again, super simple. If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe. If you have any questions, obviously comment below. I do answer all the comments. I'll also be coming out with full in-depth guides for every single healer spec, hopefully before launch, although it's getting pretty close and I haven't finished everything yet, so wish me luck on that one. Thank you for watching. See ya.
Swobu, Zug Zug.